gave instructions concerning his bones.
To much of the discussion in today's religious world, and maybe even if you listen to a number of religious people, you're going to get the impression, the distinct impression, that faith is sort of like a hope or a wish. We hear talk about people of faith in various religious groups, and when that is probed or discussed further, it would appear that many people think that faith is sort of hoping for something out there, maybe wishing that God exists or that we're going to go to heaven one day. And you might get a real misunderstanding of biblical faith. The Bible doesn't describe faith as a mere wish or a hope. Although hope is an important concept, faith is something different. And so that's one reason I appreciate the Hebrew writer's statement here right off the bat in chapter 12, or 11 rather, beginning with verse 1, with regard to faith. He says that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And the American Standard Version and some of the other translations include the words assurance or the conviction. The idea is of a certainty. And I'm going to ask you this morning to probe your own heart and ask yourself this question. Are you a person of faith? Do you believe, and by that I mean are convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that God is? Are you convinced of that? Do you believe that Jesus Christ is his Son, that he actually, literally came to this earth, lived a life of demonstration, and was crucified, shedding his blood for the sins of this world? Do you believe that? And do you believe that Jesus was raised from the dead on the third day to die no more, but to come again and take home with him the redeemed of all ages? Do you believe in heaven? Do you believe you're going to heaven? I didn't ask you, do you hope you're going to heaven? Because I know what the answer to that one is. I mean, you ask that to anybody. Oh, yeah, I hope I'm going there. Do you believe in your heavenly home? That there is a place reserved for you? The Bible describes the faith of the Christian as a certainty. It's just a matter of time, folks, until we're there. We may, you and I, have a chance to discuss this sermon there, or some other event in your life. Hey, do you remember when such and such happened? It kind of reminded me that we're going to be here one day. I believe in God and in Jesus Christ, his Son. And the Scriptures require faith like that. So the purpose of this chapter is to show us what faith looks like. That's what this gallery of the faithful is. These heroes of the faith that are presented here, as if to say, I'm not only going to just define it for you, I'm going to show you what it looks like in practice, in the lives of great men and women all down through the ages. Look at Abel. Look at Sarah and Abraham and Moses. Look at Jacob. And this morning, look at Joseph. Talk about a life of faith. If you have ever felt like life is really giving you a kick in the teeth, it's just not fair, then you need to think about Joseph for a while. I can't help but think that he would be an encouragement to you if you've been thinking that things are a little bit unfair. I mean, here is a man who's practically his whole life before Egypt and the events that unfolded there is just one unfairness after another. But he never loses his faith in God. Never. Someone was commenting just the other day about this man. This is one of the guys in the Bible about whom we don't read any bad things. It's all good. It's all good. The Hebrew writer links him to Jacob in these two verses that were just read for us. We studied Jacob last week, so let's look at Joseph for a moment. By faith, Joseph, when his end was nigh, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave commandment concerning his bones. You might say, well, how does that show faith? Oh, yes. Joseph not only understood that he was not going to live forever, which incidentally is something that many Americans do not yet understand. Not only that I'm not going to live forever, that I'm going to die, that my bones are going to have to be deposited and left somewhere, I understand that we're not going to be in this nation of Egypt forever. And I want my bones put into a coffin. And when you leave here, you bring them with you. There's something coming, he knew, greater than this. And he knew that it was going to come because of God. Well, when you look at the bullet points of Joseph's life, you go back to Jacob for a moment. Remember that in Padan Aram, Jacob had agreed to labor for 7 years for Laban. And Jacob, a trickster, got a taste of his own medicine when Laban kindly tricked him. And he ended up, you remember, laboring for those 7 years for Rachel. In chapter 29, verse 17, the text says, and Leah's eyes were tender, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And Jacob loved Rachel. And he said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. And Laban said, it is better that I give her to thee than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me. Man, he should have been a politician, you know. Talk about a safe answer. I mean, your future son-in-law says, I'm going to work for you 7 years if you'll let me marry your daughter. I realize she's not your eldest, she's your youngest. 7 years. And Laban says, you know what? That makes a lot of sense. It's really good what you're saying. In fact, it's better that I give her to thee than that I should give her to another man. Go ahead, come on in and stay and work for me. And he acted like he was doing Jacob a big favor. The next verse says, and Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had for her. Who got the better of that deal? Well, Laban, of course, substituted his oldest daughter, Leah. Jacob worked 7 more years for Rachel, and Leah bore children. Bore Jacob children while Rachel was barren. Isn't it interesting how life is? The ironies of life. Here is Jacob longing for his beautiful bride to be, Rachel, and they get married, and all of the labor and the preparation that goes into that, and lo and behold, she's not able to have children. She's barren. But there's old Leah. She's able to have children, and we talked about all those various children, itemized them from the text last week, but God heard Rachel's suffering. And I'm sure that he saw in the heart of Jacob that suffering too. is born. It may be that Jacob thought God has saved the best for last. Well, Jacob favored Joseph for whatever reason, and we noticed last week, and here again, parents, favoritism among children is always bad. It's never right to do the wrong. We may say, oh yeah, but Joseph was the child of promise. I mean, he had so much in store, and that was where God's plan was going to. That's true. All of that is true. But we honor Jacob not because he favored Joseph. He favored him above all his other children, made him the coat of many colors, you remember. Genesis chapter 37, verse 3. And then verse 4 says, and his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, and they hated him, and could not speak peaceably unto him. Isn't that tragic? Have you ever known of brothers, fleshly brothers, although these are half-brothers, but they were right there in the same home, raised together, and they had the same father, and yet they couldn't speak peaceably one to another? Do you have a brother or sister to whom you cannot speak peaceably? I hope not. That is a tragic situation. But it was triggered by the favoritism, the partiality shown by the father, Jacob, and that should never have occurred, should not have been. Well, their hatred grew when Joseph, apparently in all innocence, I mean, he didn't say this to rub salt in the wound, but he told them about those boyhood dreams that he'd had. Remember? The heavenly planets bowing down to him, and the sheaves. Your sheaves bowed down to mine. What are you saying, Joseph? That we're going to bow down to you? Well, Joseph may not have been saying that at all. He was just sharing his dreams. Who gave him those dreams? God did. And when he shared them with his brothers, that made them hate him even more. At 17 years old, the brothers were out at some great distance in the field, and his father became concerned about them. So he sent Joseph on a very dangerous mission. When you think about it, this again makes me wonder a little bit about the judgment of Jacob at this point. But he sends Joseph out there. Go check on your brothers. They saw him coming, and they were in the land of Shechem at first. His brothers saw him and determined to kill him. We will see what comes of this dreamer's dreams. And they decided to kill him. Well, I'm thankful that there was one in their number who had a little more sense than that, although I really question his wisdom at times. That was Reuben, the oldest, you remember? No, let's not kill him. We don't want to shed innocent blood. And Reuben devised a plan. Let's just put him into this pit. What was Reuben going to do? Come back later and rescue him, the text says. He convinced them to throw him into a pit, and then Judah, he's the money man. Hey, I got an idea. Let's sell him. Let's sell him. Here's a caravan of Ishmaelites, very convenient. And 20 pieces of silver was a little less than the price of a common slave. They sold their brother for less than the price of a common slave. Chapter 37, verses 18 through 28. So these Midianites, who are a subset of the Ishmaelites, sold him into Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's captain of the guard. And we find that his brothers deceived their father by dipping his coat, you remember, into the blood of a wild animal. And can you imagine the agony that they had to see in their father's face as he looked at that blood-stained coat of many colors? and he concluded that his precious son had been killed by a wild beast. What kind of human treachery and animus could stand there and allow their father to suffer like that? That tells us, friends, something of how deep human hatred can be when God is left out of the picture. Well, in Egypt, Joseph prospered. He prospered and God was with him. The verse says, and Jehovah was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Here is a lesson as we pass, and we note it quickly at this point to come back to it in a moment. God notices us even when we're being treated unfairly. God hasn't left you. God hasn't departed from you. You say, well, if there was a God, he surely wouldn't let this happen. Friends, there is a God. And because of the effects of sin in this life, things do happen. Look at Joseph. Here he is, sold into slavery, abandoned, almost killed by his own flesh and blood brothers. But God is with him. And he doesn't forget that, even in Egypt, in the land of Egypt, chapter 39 and verse 2. But there, of course, Potiphar's wife sees him as an attractive young man, makes advances towards him, which he spurns. He says, no, I cannot do that to whom? To my master and to God. He understood, even there, the clarity of a moral compass in his life. He kept his focus where it needed to be. And she set him up, and he was imprisoned. Now, there again, treated so unfairly in life. Have you ever been in a prison cell? Has anybody here ever been in a prison? If you have, I guarantee you it was nothing like the prison cell into which Joseph was cast. I've been in a few prison cells. I wouldn't want to spend very long in them, but they are a palace compared to this one. Joseph had every reason to think that God had forgotten all about him. What am I doing down here in Egypt, so far from home where my brothers hate me? And now I'm in prison because he had done what was right and moral and just. In prison, God had not forgotten him, gave him the opportunity to interpret two dreams, and God was the interpreter. But he did it through Joseph. Remember the chief baker, and it told him their dreams, and he interpreted them. He said that God has given us the interpretation, and both interpretations came true. Can God use events in your life to advance his providential goals for you? Can God make things happen in your life that are providential in nature? Can God bring it about? Well, in prison, that's what God was doing with Joseph. And when Pharaoh later had a troubling dream, and he was very troubled by it, he couldn't understand it, but it was so vivid, so clear, and it moved him. Have you ever had a dream like that? You woke up in a cold sweat, and you can picture it all. Now, many people can't really remember their dreams, at least not very clearly, but Pharaoh remembered this one. And he told his master's advisors about it. But nobody could give the proper interpretation of the dream until the chief butler wakes up and says, I remember there was a man in prison with me who interpreted my dreams. Pharaoh says, bring him quickly. The text says that he was shaven. He was shaved and washed and bathed. Now that tells you something about what he was suffering in prison. and he was brought before the Pharaoh. Did he say, "Oh yeah, I can interpret your dream, Pharaoh"? Oh no. There's a God in heaven who can do that. Tell me the dream. Well, it had to do, you remember, with the 7 lean cows eating up the 7 fat cows, which foretold 7 years of plenty to be followed by 7 years of severe famine. Now, we're having a little drought right now, incidentally. Someone was commenting right before services how dry it is, and it is. It's really dry. We need rain. We need it badly. It's nothing like the famine in Egypt at that time. 7 years of drought. And Pharaoh immediately grasped the seriousness of that situation. It would be necessary to really save up for the next 7 years to survive that, because this is going to be a worldwide, in this whole region, not just here in Egypt, but throughout the known world. This is going to be a serious problem, a famine. Well, at 30 years of age, Pharaoh makes Joseph the ruler of Egypt. Imagine that. One day he's in prison, suffering and afflicted and torn and wondering what in the world has happened to my life. And at age 30, just a short time later, he is the ruler of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. And I want you to figure out a way to store up enough grain to get us through that famine. I'm told that modern archaeologists have discovered in that part of the world ancient granaries that apparently were used to store vast quantities of grain in the event of a famine. He also gave him, no doubt, a very beautiful wife by the name of Asenath, chapter 41, verses 37 through 45. And she, incidentally, was from a very priestly, important family. And he begat 2 sons. Their names were Manasseh and Ephraim, in that order. The oldest was Manasseh and Ephraim. They were the same ones, you remember, when Jacob was dying. He told Joseph, "Bring those young men in here." And Joseph arranged them in such a way that Jacob, when he laid his hands on them and pronounced the blessing, he would pronounce the blessing on the oldest one first, Manasseh. But Jacob pulled a fast one on him. Even at that age, he crossed his arms and put his right hand on the head of the younger, Ephraim. And Joseph said, No, Dad, you got that wrong. Here, let me get that. No. What I have done, I've done. These 2 boys, I have adopted them. They're mine. And I'm giving the blessing of the firstborn to the younger. Well, those 2 sons are born to Joseph's wife, Asenath. He begets them there in Egypt, and the famine becomes severe. It afflicted Jacob's family all the way back in Canaan, and his brothers are suffering. And what do? They hear there's food, there's grain in Egypt, and they make the trip. God can use natural events to bring about His will, and we need to cooperate. The famine afflicted Jacob's family in Canaan. His brothers came and bowed down to him, just like his boyhood dreams had predicted. But they didn't recognize him. They didn't know that's Joseph that we're bowing down to. And so Joseph questions them intelligently, closely. Tell me about your family, especially your dad, your father, and that young son, Benjamin. And he arranged for them to bring Benjamin on their return journey. Remember that? Keeping Simeon as the hostage. Y'all come back now, because I've got your brother. And they did. And they brought Benjamin. And then he planted a silver cup in Benjamin's bag when they left, and that was a ruse, a plot, so that he could be accused of wrongdoing, and that was used as an excuse to keep them there in Egypt. Now, put yourself in the position of his brothers. They're afraid for their life. This is the ruler of Egypt, and they're bowing down before him, and now they've been accused of a serious offense of theft from the king himself. Judah, the money man, passionately pleads, please, our father, Jacob, would never survive this news. And that was the thing that brought the tears to Joseph's eyes. The text says, then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him, and he cried, cause every man to go out from me. And there stood no man with him while Joseph made himself known to his brethren. Isn't that cool? And he persuades them, get your dad, get father. We've got some prime land here in Egypt. It's called the land of Goshen, and that's going to be your new home. 370 in that household, y'all come, all of you, to the land of Goshen, which they did. And Jacob died there, a happy man, 17 years later. He was 147 years old, having had the chance to see his son, Joseph, alive again and successful there in the land of Egypt. Joseph recognized the hand of God in these events. He says in chapter 50, verses 20 and 21, as for you, referring to his brothers, ye meant it as evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. And now, therefore, fear ye not. In other words, don't be afraid. And those were the very words they needed the most to hear from their brother. Don't be afraid. I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly to them. These are the same fellows that couldn't speak kindly to him, but he speaks kindly to them and comforts them. And he dies at 110 years of age. Joseph, great man of God. Before he died, he did give that order concerning his body. The Egyptians practiced the ancient art of embalming. He said, I want to be embalmed. I want you to put my bones in my body, that is, in the coffin, to be carried up out of here. Chapter 50 of Genesis has these words beginning at verse 25. Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you. Now, do you see the faith in that statement? And he shall carry up but ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. What is faith? Well, we've seen that faith is developed over many trials, and you can certainly see the trials and the problems in this man's life and tribulations. Faith doesn't come overnight. But lastly, faith does not question or forsake God. Even in the face of great unfairness. I have known of some members of the church who were so upset about having to wear a mask that they were done. Joseph suffered all of these things and, to our knowledge, never questioned or forsook God. That's faith. God is saying, I've got a purpose for this, for you, for your life. Have confidence in the providence of God. Remember Hebrews 11, verse 10 about Abraham? For he looked for a city that hath the foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And Moses, chapter 11 and verse 26, accounting that the reproach of Christ was greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked unto the recompense of reward. He had faith. And Joseph had faith. Are you a person of faith? Is your life really that difficult? By comparison, that you could even begin to think about giving up on God. These heroes of faith surround us, brethren. They live in the pages of God's Word to show us what faith is. And Jesus says, "Come unto me in faith." Confess your faith before men. Put him on in baptism for the remission of your sins and live faithfully for him as a child of God. Have you done these things?